I am a black man and a representative of black people. I hold the rank of General Field Marshal in the United Federated Forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army.
The thing is, there is no rank of General Field Marshal, and there is no United Federated Forces of any army. Within 2 years after he founded the SLA, Donald Defreeze and his plans would come to an end in an exchange of slugs with the largest shootout with police in California's history. This is the story of Donald Defreeze, the kidnapping of Patricia Hurst, and the Symbionese Liberation Army. The SLA was founded by a 29-year-old Defreeze, and in less than 2 years after it started, all the members would be dead or in prison. Defreeze was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and had a rough childhood just like most households who didn't have enough money and too many mouths to feed. His father didn't make life any easier. He used to beat him up regularly, and on separate occasions broke a few of his bones and caused emotional issues that would last a lifetime. In his early teenage years, he left his family in Cleveland and moved to Buffalo, New York, where he would fit in with the wrong crowd. It wouldn't take much time for law enforcement to be involved. At a young age, he always shown an interest in firearms, and as a young teenager, he was arrested for carrying a pistol and sent to a reform school named Elmira. His time in Elmira was no fun, and it changed him. So after he got out, he left New York and made New Jersey his new home. He continued to make bad decisions, and one of those decisions was to marry a woman with 3 kids. So now, he was 19 years old with a ready-made family. The marriage was just what you would expect. They had a child, then he left. During the time away from his family, he was caught with another firearm and received some jail time for his troubles. While he was away, his wife had another child with another man. The couple would later get back together, and around 1967, Defreeze and his family moved to California, and they had another child. To keep count, of those 6 kids, only 2 of those kids was his. Defreeze would continue to play with weapons and had a habit of dismantling fireworks to make explosive devices. He spent his teenage and early 20s growing up in a time of America's war with Vietnam and racial unrest in every city that he lived in. Another interaction with law enforcement would lead to his arrest after he was searched. A gun was found tucked into his waistband. After pleading guilty, he received 3 years probation. Just a few months later, he robbed a woman of the night. She called the cops, and when they arrived, he was arrested. When they searched his car, they found 10 more guns. To avoid serving time for the 10 weapons, 2 days later, he did what criminals do. He agreed to become an informant. Back then, law enforcement had hundreds of black men like Defreeze that they used to infiltrate groups like the Black Panthers and the Gangster Disciples. As an informant, he continued to commit crimes and abuse pills and other forms of drugs. Along with the civil rights movement, the death of black leaders, and the horrific events of the Vietnam War, American citizens wanted change. The unequal treatment of certain groups of prisoners in the prison systems was also a visual representation acknowledged by society. Everyone knew what was going on, and California played a big part in fighting back against what was happening. Many citizens came together and protested against the system, and many protests for social change involved the young adults and college campuses. It turned into violence on both sides, as college campuses were being destroyed by both the police and the protesters. For some of those students who felt things were not morally right, they felt the only way to change things was to have an armed revolution. The students wanted to organize, and part of that consisted of students visiting prisons to educate and spread the political voice of change with men serving hard time. It was part of the black prisoner reform movement. In those days, a medical facility named Vacaville was known for experimental programs that was partially funded by the government. These programs dealt with psychological research on controlling one's behavior by use of experimental chemicals that did horrible things to a person's mind. Sometime around 1970, Defreeze, who by now was a career criminal, was sentenced to 5 to life in that same medical facility. He received that sentence for things that included robbing a woman and trying to cash a check in her name. 3 men, Joe, Russ and Wolf were students working in the prisoner reform program and did work inside the prison system in California, and that's where they met Defreeze. As time went on, Defreeze would become a fugitive after somehow escaping prison, and with nowhere to go, he linked up with political students he met from the prison reform movement. While he was hiding out with them, he met other students with like minds. Their similar thoughts of an armed revolutionary change was the beginning of the SLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army. In 1973, they crossed the line. They stalked a school superintendent who was a hero to many people. His name was Marcus Foster. They put cyanide on the tip of their bullets, and at point-blank range, they did the unthinkable. He didn't make it.
It began last November when Oakland School Superintendent Marcus Foster was shot to death outside his office by a trio of hooded assassins. Witnesses described one of the three as a woman, and the next day the Symbionese Liberation Army took credit for the killing.
A few days later, they made a statement to let the world know that the SLA was responsible. This was the first time the world has ever heard of the SLA. 2 months after that, Joe and Russ was pulled over with weapons and SLA paraphernalia in the vehicle. Joe got out the car, and at 6 feet away from each other, he and the police officer had a shootout. No one was hit, but the weapon used was the same weapon a female SLA member used in the hit on Mr. Foster. Even though Joe and Russ didn't do it, they were charged with the murder of Foster. By this time, the other members of the SLA had to change location, so they set fire to the house that they were living in order to hide evidence before they left. However, the fire started, but after they left, the fire went out. So law enforcement found all kinds of goodies, like weapons and a list of possible kidnapping victims. The investigation of the SLA continued, but for some reason, law enforcement never warned anyone on the list that their safety was at risk. One of the names on the list belonged to a girl named Patricia Hurst. She was the daughter of a powerful and rich family that owned a media empire. They represented everything the SLA thought was wrong with America's capitalist entitled society. So on February 4th at 9:30 p.m., Defreeze, Bill, and Angela went to the house where Patricia lived with her fiancé. Angela knocked on the door claiming she had an accident and needed to use the phone. When they opened the door, Defreeze and Bill burst into the apartment and beat up the fiancé and tied up Patricia, took her out the house and threw her in the trunk of a car.
There's been a big kidnapping on the West Coast. The victim is Patricia Hurst, the daughter of newspaper executive Randolph Hearst and a granddaughter of the legendary William Randolph Hearst.
Well, I heard a scream, and then I heard what were gunshots, and I looked out the window, and all I saw were the sparks of the gun going off, and I hit the floor.
Did you hear the girl who was being taken out say anything?
Well, I heard her pleading, "Please no, not me," or words to that effect.
3 days later, the SLA claimed responsibility, and for the next few weeks, they kept Patricia locked up in a closet in fear for her life, 24 hours a day after day, week after week, month after month, until something happened. The SLA started sharing the dinner table and conversating with Patricia. They started giving her access to weapons. She started having sexual relationships with members of the SLA. She changed her name to Tanya and was willing to prove her commitment to the cause. It was beyond belief until 2 months later. The SLA needed money to support themselves, so on April 15, 1974, they robbed a bank. Surveillance cameras showed that Patricia was one of the robbers holding bank tellers and security at bay with a loaded machine gun. A few weeks later, FBI raided an apartment in San Francisco. They just happened to be a few days late as the SLA members just left. And after further investigation, law enforcement found weapons and parts that could be used to make an explosive device. 2 weeks after that, Bill and Emily went to a sporting goods store in Inglewood to get some supplies. After they left the store, an employee confronted them about shoplifting, and a scuffle started. Patricia was outside in a van with the key in the ignition. She could have left and rescued herself, but she waited for her comrades. When she saw the scuffle, she grabbed a machine gun and unloaded. No one was hit, but she shot up the store and they all took off. After they left, the van broke down, so they carjacked the motorist and took his car. Police started to receive tips from the public, and they were alerted to a yellow house on 54th Street in Compton. They were told that this was the SLA's hideout, and Patricia could be inside. After all, she's still a victim. FBI, SWAT, and more than 500 police officers surrounded the house, and all hell broke loose.
Police and FBI agents surrounded this small house on East 54th Street in the south central area of the city. Shortly before 6 p.m., gunfire erupted. For more than an hour, thousands of rounds of automatic weapons and small gunfire were exchanged between police and the suspects inside the house. 6 tear gas assaults were made in an attempt to flush out the fugitives.
The shootout would last for an hour. SLA would let off more than 4,000 rounds, and the LAPD would do the same. Something in the house blew up and started a fire. Nancy tried to get out the back door and was hit. She didn't make it. The SLA continued to let off rounds until all of a sudden, it stopped. Camilla, Soltysik, Wolf, Angela, and Defreeze were all found after the fire was put out. Law enforcement recovered 18 guns and 2 pipe bombs. The search was now focused on the remaining members, Bill, Emily, and Patricia. The remaining SLA members left California and made their way to New York, but they wanted revenge for what happened in the Yellow House, so a few months later they went right back to California and got with a different crew. They needed money, so they robbed a bank. Patricia waited outside while the others went into the bank. During the robbery, Emily unloaded, causing the passing of a mother of 4. Another member put their hands on a pregnant woman, causing her to lose her unborn child. In August of '75, with revenge on their mind, they started to build pipe bombs. Patricia goes to a police station and puts a bomb under a police car. No one was hurt. A few weeks later, they placed bombs at a courthouse. The crew kept planting bombs under cop cars with 3-inch nails as shrapnel, with the intention to kill as many cops as possible. Some of these bombs went off and some of them didn't. The FBI finally got some information that led them to a location where they arrested Bill and Emily. In that house, they found multiple weapons and homemade pipe bombs. They went to another location and found Patricia, and before she could grab her machine gun, they arrested her. So now, at 1.5 years after her kidnapping, she was in custody. They would all go to trial for what they did and would all be sentenced to prison. Patricia was convicted of bank robbery in March of 1976. During this time, on November 18, 1978, an unrelated event would help influence this dynamic story. Have you ever heard the term, "he drank the Kool-Aid"? It's an expression that refers to a person who simply believes anything another person tells them to believe, due to popularity or persuasion. It relates to an event that happened in 1978 in a country named Guyana, where an American cult led by the real Jim Jones influenced over 900 people to drink a powdered drink mix laced with cyanide and commit mass suicide. This event affected the sentiment on Patricia's court case and the general public to show how people under the right situation can be influenced to do things even if it's harmful to themselves. After serving almost 2 years, President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence, making her a free woman. Then in 2001, 22 years later, another president, President Bill Clinton, on the last day of his presidency, he granted her a full pardon. So according to her criminal record, it's like it didn't even happen. This was the story of Donald Defreeze, Patricia Hurst, and the Symbionese Liberation Army. Be sure to follow Gully TV on the Dribble podcast, available on all streaming sites, and visit the website therealdribble.com to pick up an autographed copy of Some Things I've Been Through. a Gully TV memoir predicated on his relationships with some of America's most notorious black gangsters and drug lords. This Alan Evans from Big City Crime TV. Until next time, y'all keep it Gully. Peace.